Kathleen, you ready to go? Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the 5th meeting of the Transmission Corridors Work Group. Kathleen, I'd like to turn it over to you for opening comments.
Hey, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Now I had my comments up in front of me and they've disappeared, of course. But I just would like to say welcome to everybody. This is group, our 5th of 6 meetings. And this meeting, we're moving from really our listening mode and learning mode into a more bringing all those thoughts together as we move to our findings and our recommendations. And we have a lot of work in front of us. So I appreciate you all being here to help come to that conclusion. I think as we look at the work in today and tomorrow, we really have information about one of the most significant challenges that face our state in meeting our clean energy transformation goals, and that is really the high power transmission lines. And what do we do to really move the energy from where it's generated, whether it's in our state or outside of our state, to the areas that it needs to be used for the population centers and for business and the economy. So those are our challenges in front of us. And I think we have some very exciting speakers and good information coming forward. And I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Okay, so a couple of quick notes. So I'm gonna, for the folks that are watching on the live stream, we have public comment on this meeting, and that's going to occur tomorrow at around 11:45. And so we will provide the Zoom information for that public comment on the live stream. I want to quickly review the agenda, and then I want to get into the substance of the meeting pretty quickly after that. So today we have an opening set of presentations that we're calling our deep dive presentations. So in between meetings 4 and 5, we sent an email out to the group and asked, are there things that you want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on that you think might be useful as we are in the process of pulling together the principles that we're going to be talking about. We've got 3 recommendations, and we're going to have 3 quick presentations: benefits on regional transmission coordination with Megan Decker, flow-based modeling with Vic Howell, and then analysis of east-to-west transmission conditions in the Pacific Northwest with Randy Hardy. We're going to have about 10 minutes of presentation on each of those topics, and then we're going to have a Q&A. We're going to take a break. We're taking a little bit of an early break so we can get ourselves our breakout rooms prepared for our following session. So our following session, we're going to start diving into some of the content that Kathleen foreshadowed that we want to talk to you all about. We're going to talk about challenges and opportunities that we documented coming out of meeting 3, some principles on permitting and principles on siting, construction and planning. And then we're going to break out into breakout groups to review the content that we generated from the last meeting around principles on expediting environmental review. We'll come back out of those breakouts, do a quick preview of the next day, and then the next day we're going to spend all in our full plenary. And so without further ado, I will review tomorrow's agenda tomorrow. Without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'd like to now turn to our first session, which are some of these deep diving presentations. So before I turn it over to Megan, Kathleen or Joe, is there any context that you want to set for these upcoming presentations?
No, I think Kathleen's intro was good. I think we're good to go.
Okay, great. So Megan, what I'd like to do is I'd ask that you quickly introduce yourself to the group and then jump in. We ask that remarks are kept to around 10 minutes, and then we'll provide some time for questions after. So Megan, take it away.
Okay. Good morning, everyone out there. My name is Megan Decker, and I'm the chair of the Oregon Public Utility Commission. I just yesterday celebrated my 5-year anniversary as a commissioner, and I'm reflecting this morning that transmission is one of those very difficult subjects that well, I've learned a lot over those 5 years. I recognize that my knowledge and certainly my takes on the subject remain somewhat impressionistic and maybe a little idiosyncratic, grounded in what I've run into in my role as an Oregon commissioner. So this impressionistic portrayal of transmission lines behind me is meant to remind you that that is where I'm coming from. And I hope that we have some time for Q&A to sort of unpack or challenge some of the things that I'll say this morning. Why is transmission planning and development coordination in the West important, grounded in where I'm coming from? I think of it as 2 reasons. One, so we can have more confidence that we're making good decisions about costs and impacts. And 2, so we can have more confidence that we can meet our policy goals. And those may be primarily addressing climate change, reducing greenhouse gases. They may also be economic development, community impacts, things like that. So on the first goal, why do I think transmission planning and regional transmission planning is important to having more confidence that we're making good decisions about costs and impacts? As I'm sure you know, utility regulators have the task to determine whether transmission costs are reasonable enough to pass on to people who use electricity, just as siting officials have what I think might be even the harder task of accepting some land impacts in pursuit of a larger scale need. And I, as a decision maker, want to know that projects that come in for cost recovery, probably just like those who want to make siting decisions, I want to know that those are the best long-term investments for the region as a whole, that they are the most economically efficient way of meeting needs that I and the stakeholders that are important to the commission's process have had a chance to define and vet. And I want, once we have that confidence, all beneficiaries of regionally significant projects to be at the table for a fair and transparent cost allocation discussion. We know that when you start looking at these, really any transmission projects, but certainly those that are larger and more regionally significant, that the benefits flow throughout the region. This isn't a point A to point B conversation. And I think planning can do a better job of helping us understand what those benefits are and therefore how we should allocate the costs. So the second thing I said is that I want to have more confidence that we can meet our policy goals. Oregon, like Washington, has ambitious clean electricity legislation, tagline 100% clean by 2040, lots more to it as with your law there in Washington. And there is, putting it mildly, a lack of confidence that we have the grid that is best suited to meet those multi-decade longer term policy goals and certainly to do so at the lowest possible cost or the highest value, if you want to think of it that way. I can talk about some of the reasons why I think that confidence, how that confidence can grow and what we can do to increase that confidence. But I think it's really important that we be able to have a good, transparent look further out in the future at trade-offs. where resources come from, different visions of that, who they benefit and impact in terms of economic development and environmental justice. And that's really the kind of scenario-based examination of different possible futures that we're accustomed to in resource planning, integrated resource planning, using production cost models. I think that I understand somewhat at this point in my career why that is more challenging for transmission planning, because you're using power flow modeling, and I'm looking forward to hearing about that from one of our other speakers. But the fact is, with transmission taking as long as it does to get developed, we need to have longer term looks at where the region is going from a resource and load perspective. And even if we can't be certain about that, so that we can start to understand the trade-offs among different transmission investments. What is currently happening? I'm going to just take 1 or 2 more minutes, and then hopefully we can get into some dialogue. I think of 3, maybe 4 levels of transmission planning: regional studies, Order 1000 processes, and sort of single utility processes. Regional studies are things that I think of as being done by, the national labs. Perhaps WEC has been involved in those in the past, and perhaps will be in the future. I know that the Western Interstate Energy Board is taking on some things to look at a higher level across the region at the resource future and the transmission needs that might be part of that. That's one area that see, that was my timer for myself. I can't make it go off. Okay. The second level is the Order 1000 FERC mandated regional planning processes, and theoretically the FERC mandated interregional planning that fits those together. There's a lot of conversation going on right now about how that can do more of what I was just talking about, look further in the future, have more scenario-based planning, better capture the range of costs and benefits. I want to thank Kathleen and Joe and Ann Rendall and those from Washington that have leaned into Northern Grid, which is our region's Order 1000 transmission planning process, to try to be more involved and more engaged with each other and get more out of that process. I think that there are potentially some bright spots there, and there's also a national conversation at the FERC level going on about how to sort of set higher expectations for those organizations, overall. The last layer is that kind of single utility, whether it's local planning or interconnection. That's where all of this kind of starts. That local planning process is what feeds transmission projects into the regional planning processes. Those are pretty opaque. Those are where the rubber meets the road, and there's not a lot of people watching or engaged in those. So, I'd like to see those that are responsible for funding and thinking about how we do more in transmission, help us think as commissions, as advocacy groups, whatever, about how to resource engagement in some of that local planning. Obviously, the last layer is project by project interconnection requests, or for BPA, the TSEP process. Those are really important too for providing information. But when you're coming at it from a state and you're just trying to understand, for instance, as Oregon has been, how does offshore wind in Southern Oregon look in the region? How does it change the region? What transmission solutions, would be viable to help that develop? That's not that kind of question can be asked when you have a single developer coming in, but sometimes you want to ask those questions before that point. And so I think maybe all of these places need more room for that. People are leaning into this conversation. I really recommend the Committee on Regional Electric Power Cooperation, the CREPC YRAB meetings that are held twice a year. This upcoming one at the beginning of May, we'll be talking a lot about regional transmission issues, and look forward to continuing the conversation both here and there. Thanks a lot.
Great. Megan, thank you. So we've got obviously some time for questions here or comments. So I'm going to invite folks to raise their hand by hitting Alt-Y to let me know they want to jump into the conversation if you have questions. And then I got one here in the queue for you, Megan, from the chat. The question is, could you summarize for the group at a high level what is involved in production cost modeling?
Wow, it will be a high level, and I'm gonna, I'll have to, I know someone is coming in to talk about flow-based modeling, and I bet the entire, the first three things that they say will be about how flow-based modeling is different from production cost modeling. But at a high level, I think it's really an economic model of how generation is dispatching and moving around the region. It tells you some things about where you might have transmission congestion and as it affects the economics, but it doesn't give you that sort of reliability level look that a power flow modeling will give you, where transmission planners will sort of stress the system and see how it responds. I hope the next panelist can do a better job than that, but
Great, thank you, Megan. Glenn, if folks just don't mind quickly introducing yourself so Megan knows who she's talking to, that'd be great. Glenn?
We go way back.
Okay, no need then.
I remember Megan when she worked in Washington State, so there. I'm Glenn Blackman, and I'm from the Department of Commerce, the State Energy Office. And thanks for your overview of that, Megan. We've been really interested in the possibilities of inter-regional planning and development, and have followed the work that's been going on at the federal level at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And one thing that I've been thinking about in that process is how different the Northwest seems compared to what FERC thinks about and kind of understands the dials that they can turn with regions that have organized wholesale markets like regional transmission organizations, and where FERC actually regulates a lot of the participants in those markets. And in the Northwest, we don't really have a RTO. Some of the entities that are very important in our power system aren't regulated by FERC. How can we capture some of those big benefits given the way our system is organized right now? Or what do we need to do to catch up with the rest of the country, if anything?
That's a great question, and really the question as it relates to coordination across the entire region. I guess I have kind of two answers. One is that if you look back to kind of the mid 2000s, the projects that we have that are moving through the process right now, I think came from this kind of regional study level engagement that I was talking about. I think we have to look to, in the near term, to begin planning for kind of the next generation of transmission investments to the institutions that we have. I think we have to be talking about whether WEC can play a role, not in saying what has to happen in the region, but in giving us a little more visibility. I understand that Department of Energy, U.S. Department of Energy has funds for this, and I think how we use those is a little opaque to me. But again, some of those extra utility, like above the utility level studies, I think are going to have to be one way we do it. I mean, the other answer is, and people talk about whether the market development conversation, can we really do this until we have a central organized market across the West? I don't know. I mean, that's a good question, but we have to, from my perspective. So I think that the market development conversations and the transmission planning conversations just somehow have to happen in parallel. I mean, they're happening in parallel right now. The Western Interstate Energy Board is hosting an important conversation with Southwest Power Pool about their market development, as we speak. And it's a lot of work for those of us that are following these things. But I think we can't wait, for an RTO to do transmission planning, in part because it's not perfect, even when you have one centralized provider of transmission planning. And I think we're seeing that in the national discussion about how transmission planning is working well or less well in different organized markets. One more thing I'm going to say, CAISO is, one bright spot that I would say is that the California Independent System Operator, which is the only, organized market or full organized market in the West right now, did recently have its transmission planning function do a 20-year study that does a little bit more of that kind of scenario work that I'm talking about. And I think that them having shown the leadership to do that is starting to create some conversations about how the rest of the region can kind of take a page from that playbook or fall in or do something kind of parallel. So I've got some bright spots, and I think we're just going to have to sort of muddle through and use what we have. But it's important to keep those market conversations going on in parallel from my perspective.
Well, I really like that idea of taking the model that California, that long-term plan, and trying to do something like that for the rest of the West, or some version of that.
And I think there are, from the US DOE perspective, I'm not real connected in conversation with them, but it seems to me that there may be resources to do something like that with the institutions that we have. So I think that's a promising direction.
Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you. And so I just want to draw people's attention to the chat. Thank you for the folks that are providing links to acronyms and other information. So CAISO's in there, and someone earlier had put a link into the other sub-board that Megan had mentioned. Katie, I saw that you had your hand up. Katie, I don't know if you still have a question for Megan. We have time for one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Vic.
Thanks, Rob. I think I'm going to save it for later after Vic's presentation.
Okay, good. Well, why don't we turn to Vic's presentation, because it feels like there's some synergy there. Megan, thank you so much. If you can hang on the line for another 30 minutes, that would be great.
So Vic, if I can just jump in for a second, Rob. We've talked a little bit in this group about the regional planning, and you're getting more of a taste of it here, but essentially, for those who don't follow it as much as some in the group do, the Northwest has a very decentralized transmission planning. We're just not centralized, and other regions of the country are more centralized. And so that's what some of the conversation is here. So we don't really have the same opportunities to plan transmission in a structured, organized way as other regions of the country. And we can provide more conversation. I think we've alluded to it from time to time, but I just wanted to remind the group. So that's what some of the organizations that Megan was mentioning are do parts of that in the Northwest, but there's not a centralized planning.
Kathleen, thank you. Okay, Vic, I'd like to just, without any further ado, turn it right over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. How about if I share my screen? Okay. Let me know if you all can see this.
Yes, I see it I see it perfectly. Yep.
Okay. Let me get my pointer here. Okay, so just to introduce myself, my name is Vic Howell, and I work for WEC, which is the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. I'm the Director of Reliability Risk Management there, and I don't want to get too deep into who WEC is and what we do, because I don't want that to detract too much from the conversation. But you know, we are for WEC, reliability is front and center. We are one of the 6 regional entities that falls under the NERC umbrella, and we carry out lots of the delegated functions we have associated with NERC. And in my role, I oversee our event analysis, situation awareness, and some of the reliability assessments that we do. But we're very heavily involved in resource adequacy is kind of front and center these days. So we have a lot of activity there. What I want to talk to you about today, I've been asked to talk about the contract path methodology versus the flow-gate methodology or flow-based methodology. And first, I want to say that I am not at all a subject matter expert in this, but I know a little bit. And what I wanted to do today is just sort of talk about the concepts, because I know when you start talking about contract path and flow-based methodologies, what does it mean? What are we even talking about? So the idea today is just to get you a little bit of a foundation about what the concepts even mean, so that as you go forward and have subsequent conversations, it'll have a little bit more meaning to you. So there's a little bit of technical stuff here, but I'm hopeful that that we can work through that. So when you talk about the contract path method versus a flow-based method, it's all about determining how much power can be reliably transferred from here to there across the transmission system. There's a lot more to this, but at the end of the day, it's about how much power can we transfer reliably. So there's 2 general approaches. One is the contract path methodology, and the other is the flow-based methodology. What we generally see as the contract path approach is widely utilized in the Western interconnection, whereas the flow-based or flow-gate method is more widely used in the Eastern interconnection. That said, there are entities who are in the West who are moving to a flow-based methodology. So let's talk a little bit about contract path. First of all, when we say the term contract path, what do we even mean? So this is from some FERC documentation. A contract path is a path that can be designated to form a single continuous electrical path between the parties to an agreement. So I've got an example to sort of help drive that home, to paint that picture for you. So in this example, we have one generator, G1, and one load here called L1, and we have these transmission lines that are all in between. So the contract path method essentially says, okay, I want to transfer power from here to there. So in order to do that, I'm going to move that power from here to here across a contract path. So what that does is it starts with a concept called total transfer capability. So total transfer capability is when engineers get together and they do some studies and they say, you know what, based on my assessments, it looks like we can reliably transfer a total of 1,000 megawatts across this path here. So once you establish the TTC, or the total transfer capability, then you say, okay, now that I've established that, now I want to actually move 100 megawatts from this generator 1 over to this load 1. So the way that's done is, according to the contract path method, we make that agreement, and it is assumed that 100% of that flow moves along this contracted path. And once you make that agreement and that agreement's in place, then the total transfer capability of this contracted path is reduced by 100 megawatts. So that is essentially at a high level the way the contract path method works. Now, if let's say that there is no available transfer capability along this path, So if they still want to move power, they can say, well, if this is a contract path, is there any room on this path for me to move those megawatts? Is there any ATC on this path? And the interesting thing about this contract path methodology is, and we're going to get into this here, is that it doesn't really have a basis in reality, if you will, or how power actually flows in the system. For example, let's say G1 wants to transfer 100 megawatts from here down here to the load. Well, if I've contracted that 100 megawatts to flow across this contract path, in reality, we've got some megawatts that flow along the purple path. We've got some megawatts that flow along the orange path. We've got some megawatts that flow along the green path, and so on and so forth. So in reality, the megawatts don't care about a contract. They don't care about a contract path. Electrons and power flows along the path of least resistance across the entire network here. And it's based on the physical properties of the power system. So everything that you see here, all these colors except for the red, is going to be considered loop flow or unscheduled flow. And you may have heard that term before. We have, I've heard it said that we have a real problem in the West with unscheduled flow. And, I may be totally wrong on this, but the thing that comes to my mind is it sounds like the only real problem with unscheduled flow is the expectation for flow to occur along a contracted path. So that's a contract path methodology. Here's another short, just a high level example involving two. So you've got two generators, G1 and G2, and this is a transmission network, and then you have two loads. Well, let's say that there is a ATC path or a path, contract path going from generator 1 to L2. And there is also a contract path going from G2 over to L1. And let's say in the example that G1 wants to move 5 megawatts over to L2 along this contract path. And G2 wants to move 4 megawatts from G2 to L1 along this contracted path. And you put that on paper and the agreements are made. However, in reality, the power actually flows according to the red figure here. So the power doesn't flow where it's quote unquote scheduled to flow. It flows where it goes from sources to sinks based on the physical properties of the system. So to summarize contract path, here are a few attributes of contract path. One is it starts with total transfer capability along that contracted path. And total transfer capability calculation practices vary. They vary pretty widely. Some TTC values can be somewhat static, some can be somewhat conservative, some of them are updated more frequently than others, but the practices vary. And one of the major components of the contract path methodology is that scheduling is based on that specific path that we discussed. But we also talked about the fact that it does not account for how power actually flows in the transmission system. So that's kind of a high-level picture of the contract path methodology. Now let's talk a little bit about the flow-based method and see, excuse me, how that looks a little different. Sorry, 1 second.
While Vic is clearing his throat there, if folks have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat, and I'll try to tee them up at the end. So take it away, Vic.
Okay, so under the flow-based method, the flow-based method determines impacts on predefined flow gates. And you've probably heard that term before. So what the heck is a flow gate? Very simply, a flow gate is a transmission element on the system. Could be a line, could be a transformer. And flow gates can also account for contingency elements. For example, you can say, what's the flow on this line if this other line trips, right? So that can exist as a flow gate. The flow-based methodology also uses a power flow model as its engine when it's doing its calculations that accounts for these things listed here. So you've probably seen presentations with words, but I want to show you an example of what that actually looks like. So let's say we have a generator over here and we have a load down here. And we also, you see this border came up. Let's imagine, if you will, that all throughout here, there's a meshed network of a transmission grid. There's lines going all over everywhere between these 2 points. So under the flow-based method, a lot of really smart people come together and say, you know what, we've done all kinds of sensitivity analysis of power flows across this area, power flows from this generator over to this load. And what we've determined is that there are 3 facilities that really rise to the level of being a real concern. And these facilities can be those that are very sensitive to power transfers. And they can also be facilities that are, one, sensitive to power transfers, and also are kind of getting close to the limits when we run some of these assessments. So the determination is made, these are the different facilities that we really need to pay attention to from a reliability perspective. These are the flow gates, right? So once those flow gates are defined, the flow-based method asks the question, when I transfer 100 megawatts from G1 to L1, how does that transfer impact flow gate 1, flow gate 2, and flow gate 3? So that's the question that it's asking. And the way it answers that question is it uses what's called distribution factors. So I'll show you an example of what that looks like and how it works. But you see there's a fundamental difference between this and the contract path methodology. We're not choosing a path. We're looking at the source, we're looking at the sink, and we're looking at, well, what is impacted across the transmission system when you transfer power from that source to that sink. So let's say we've got our system here, and we also know that there are some transmission outages in a few lines throughout our meshed network. So what happens with the flow-based method is, the first thing is we understand what the planned outages are, and then we calculate distribution factors for the flow gates. And those distribution factors are calculated using a power flow model for the given topology of the system. You know, which lines are out, which ones are in. So when it calculates the distribution factor, here's what that means. The distribution factor answers this question. If I were to transfer 100 megawatts from here, G1, and send it here to L1, how much of that flow shows up on these flow gates? That's essentially a distribution factor. So the way it works is, let's say there's 100 megawatts to transfer. Based on the power flow model that underlies the machine, we've determined that the distribution factor for this configuration is 28%. So in other words, 28% of this generation, when you move power from here to here, is going to show up on this flow gate, right? And so then what happens is, you know, we know each flow gate's capability. Every facility has a facility rating. So this flow gate's capability then would be reduced by that amount, by the 28 megawatts. And then you just go through the rest of your flow gate. And our analysis says that, you know what, if we were to transfer this 100 megawatts, 16% of it, or 16 megawatts, is going to show up here. And 9 megawatts are going to show up here. So this is the idea that as you move power from here to here, where does that power show up? and so as far as the available transfer capability goes, the question that's being asked is, okay, if I move power from G1 to L1, are any of these flow gates maxed out that would prevent me from moving that power? So if any of these flow gates reach their capability that cannot accommodate that additional move of power, then the transfer capability from G1 to L1 would be 0. So that's the idea. So in a flow-based method, it starts with total flow gate capabilities. Once you define those flow gates, and there's sensitivity methods and all kinds of methods that folks use to determine which flow gates I need to create. And then the process calculates the impact on those flow gates. So as we've talked about, scheduling is based on a source and sink approach, and it looks at impacts on those flow gates and doesn't look at a specific path. And the flow-based methodology also accounts for how power actually flows in the transmission system. So what I've described to you is pretty much what I know about the flow gate methodology and the differences between the two. And I'm hopeful that as you go forward, that helps sort of paint a picture of what that actually looks like.
Thank you. That was awesome. Katie, did you have anything that you wanted to add? Katie suggested this topic, so I'm going to ask Katie if she has anything to add, and then I've got a question in the chat, and then we've got time for a couple of questions or comments before I turn it over to Randy. Katie, anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thank you, Vic. That was a really great, easily digestible presentation for lots of audiences. So I just wanted to add sort of real world context at the end of this. And, Vic did a really good job walking through what both of these methodologies look like on the side of the transmission scheduler, but on the side of like building these renewable energy projects, say a developer buys, so the way that it works currently in Washington, a developer would buy transmission for like 100 megawatts and would pay for it every hour of the year, even though it's only used 35% of the time, or whatever the capacity factor is. So a 100 megawatt flow gate could only ever support a 100 megawatt wind farm, even though that wind farm does not operate at max capacity. Whereas in an RTO, where they use security constrained economic dispatch, or SCED, which is just another way of saying what Vic is talking about here, this flow gate approach, instead of contract path, a developer would pay for the right to interconnect at a spot and then interject their energy there. And lots of studies are done to see how that impacts the grid. Upgrades may be built for reliability, deliverability, but the developer doesn't actually buy the transmission. So the power would flow based on economics and would obey the physics of the system in real time. And so then in an RTO, a 100 megawatt path could support, say, 300 wind plants, 500 megawatts of mixed wind and solar. And one other point that I wanted to make, just because of the way transmission is scheduled here in the Pacific Northwest and just getting ahead of potential issues we may think we have, I wanted to mention that RTOs do run SCED around legacy contracts, and that this is actually what the EIM is outside of California, for example. So there are things to explore. I know there are barriers, but I just wanted to put some real world context to it. And then I know there are questions in the chat, but my question from earlier, which I thought may be answerable by Vic or Commissioner Decker, is this need for a regional transmission study, perhaps by Weeb or someone else. I am wondering what it would look like on a contract path basis versus a flow gate basis, and exactly what that efficiency gain would be. And if Weeb or whoever else is considering that comparison and that methodology change for the study. Thanks for letting me add on a little bit, Rob.
No problem, Katie. Does anyone want to take a, do Vic, you or Megan, do you want to take a run at Katie's question?
I want to take a run at saying that it's a good question, and I don't, I think you should come to the CREPC YRAB meeting and ask it, and have someone there answer it. But I guess one thing I'll say about it is that when we talk about incremental market development steps, we've got this energy imbalance market where there are various efforts afoot to develop day ahead markets, and I guess reforming our transmission system so that it's operating on something more like a flow basis than a contract path basis is another incremental thing that I've heard people talking about as a possibility. And so I think from my perspective, it seems like it would be a good thing to study to understand the benefits of.
One of the unique attributes in the West is, well, let me back up. First of all, WEC, we do collaborate with stakeholders with transmission. We have a whole reliability assessments committee where we work with the industry to do, long-term reliability assessments. But WEC doesn't plan the system. That's not our swim lane. That said, one of the interesting things about the Western interconnection is, as compared to the Eastern interconnection, is we have lots of small transmission planning groups. And this is not my area at WEC, but there's no larger centralized group, which presents a real challenge for transmission planning. And one of the things that WEC is doing is we're reaching out and we're trying to understand where the pain points are and how we might be able to assist in any way to sort of get over some of those hurdles. But if you compare the West to the Eastern interconnection, where you have large regional transmission organizations, RTOs, and they have a planning function within that broad footprint for the RTO. There's nothing like that in the West. We have our FERC Order 1000 groups that were formed. Again, I'm speaking outside of my expertise, but it's just an interesting observation to see just how the unique situation the West is in there.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to have two more very quick questions in the chat, and then I'm going to come to Randy. And Randy, I'm going to keep your time whole, so I'm going to borrow some time from somewhere else. So on slide 6, Vic, that was a slide that showed the second example of the flow gate modeling. In slide 6, what does the transmission line in the middle look like in terms of ATC? Do the two contract paths of 4 megawatt and 5 megawatts cancel, or do they add?
They cancel.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the second question is, I open it up, Vic, if you don't know the answer to this. I think there may be other folks on the phone that know the answer to this. Is how often is 100% of the contracted power actually used?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I think it varies. It varies significantly. Mm-hmm. There are some paths that fill up pretty quickly. But others, I think you have quite a broad range.
Mm-hmm. Anyone on the phone have a sense? Yeah, Stu.
Well, I don't have that statistic, but in terms of real life, we've heard from folks that we do certificates for, like a wind power supplier that has had to curtail, shut down their plants because the contract power in the line was used up, but it wasn't all being used. There was actually capacity on that line, but by contract there wasn't, and so we lost that power. They lost that resource.
Thank you.
And apparently that happens a lot.
Okay, Vic, I have one final question for you, and then Randy, I'm going to come to you after this question. So Vic, the question is, in context of importing, exporting resources regionally, it seems like there's a lot of potential for efficiencies to be gained from flow-based modeling between transmission provider boundaries. How often does that happen within WECC?
How often does what happen? Help me understand the question.
Yeah, flow-based modeling out in between the boundaries of service providers, or between IOUs or BPA.
I gotcha. Well, I don't think I don't know how many entities in the West are using the flow-based methodology. I think very few are. I do know that some entities in the Arizona footprint are transitioning to a flow-based methodology. So I'm not real sure, but I think some entities are beginning to explore it. And beginning to consider moving away from a contract path methodology. And, I wonder if some folks are having a wait and see attitude to see how things go in the Arizona footprint and see what they can learn. I'm not sure.
Great. Thank you, Vic. Kathleen, any more on this one before we jump to the next one, any final thoughts on this one, Kathleen?
Thank you very much. It was very thoughtful panel and a lot of big questions raised, so appreciate that. I guess my final question, Vic, is do you play all those guitars?
Yeah, I'm more than a collector, yes.
Thank you. And Will, I saw that you physically raised your hand. Did you have a question? I'm going to make space for you real quick, Will.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out for people that are watching this, when they talk about 100 megawatts and stuff, the environmental factors might affect that. When you're thinking of a large scale, you have this much capacity, you might have maintenance happening or new projects being built out that for the people doing the work, things are shut off or are diverted to make it safe. And then, heat reduces capacity. There's other environmental factors that would reduce capacity at times. So when you think, oh, we got 100 megawatts, we got this much to move, there's a lot of things that go into that could reduce that amount.
Great, thank you, Will. Appreciate it. Okay, I'd like to now turn it over to Randy. If we could bring up, I believe we're running your slides for you, Randy, and so they should be up there on the screen. So take it away.
Great, thanks, Ross. So I have some slides, and we'll just go through them here. My background is I've been a consultant for 20 or so years, and back in another life, I used to run Bonneville, and before that, Seattle City Lights. So I've been dealing with these issues for about 40 years and have acquired at least some knowledge associated with that background. So let's dive in and go. My presentation compared to Megan's and Vic's is going to be quite specific relative to some of the issues that your work group will be dealing with. First, the current situation. Both Oregon and Washington have legislation that requires them to be 80% clean energy, and that clean includes renewables and hydro as part of that by 2030. Item number 2 is what their current status is. Puget is about 35% clean, needs to get to 80 in 8 years. PG, I don't know an exact figure, but it's about 40 to 50 and needs to get to that same point. Item number 3 on the slide indicates kind of what the capacity and energy needs are, but between now and roughly 2030 for those two utilities who are the neediest, I guess you'd say, relative to the amount of renewables that they need to acquire to meet their 2030 goals. Basically, if you look at that and sum it up, about 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts of energy by 2030 for both utilities, and 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts of capacity. Major potential problems. You've got 2 issues here, and probably a third that I didn't list, but probably should have. East to west transfer capability is a significant problem. All of your renewables and frankly, most of your capacity resources that you would need to build are going to be located on the east side, and the loads are all in Seattle and Portland and in those areas. So you have significant potential transmission issues. One is on Cross Cascade North, which is the pathway, basically the I-90 corridor from the mid-Columbias or further east to Seattle or Puget Sound area. And the second is Cross Cascade South, which is the same pattern along I-84 to get from the east side to Portland. Another potential one that I didn't list is the Raver-Paul line. It's a single circuit 500 line that runs from Federal Way down to Centralia, but it tends to get overloaded depending upon how the flows go on Cross Cascade North and South as well, even though it isn't a Cross Cascade line per se. Next slide, please. So the most recent concrete data that we have comes from the Bonneville 2021 cluster study. Bonneville does an annual cluster study to look at all the transmission service requests, abbreviated TSRs that are filed. The most recent one was released in June of last year and analyzed TSRs submitted between mid 2019 and mid 2020. You had about almost 6 gigawatts or 5,800 megawatts of TSR submitted. Probably most significant about this was Bonneville found that basically flows seeking to go from mid-C to PGE, ironically, overloaded the Raver-Paul 500 line that I mentioned earlier, and it required a $750 million fix, not for all of those TSRs, but for some of them in the queue. You reached a point where they essentially overloaded that line. Not surprisingly, faced with that kind of spending that kind of money to get an upgrade, all of the people who submitted those TSRs withdrew their TSRs when facing the next step of the line. Now, the most likely, what I'll call incremental upgrades are the two items listed in item number 4. Raver-Schultz series capacitors. These are not lines. These are devices that are put in that enable you to redirect power from overloaded lines to lesser loaded lines. You can see the subscription data there for that one. And a Portland area 230 upgrade. This involves both Bonneville lines and PGE lines or PGE equipment. And again, probably fully subscribed. I would expect a Bonneville decision probably later this year to proceed with the Raver-Schultz SCPs. That'll give you another 500 megawatts of ATC, which is on the Cross Cascade North path. And similarly, the Portland area one, we're probably a year and a half away from a decision to proceed because of the coordination between Bonneville and PGE. But that also gives you another 500 megawatts of incremental ATC on the Cross Cascade South path. Next slide, please. So where are we right now? You've got about probably 5,000 megawatts, give or take, in the current Bonneville queue. But that doesn't include all the stuff that they're currently analyzing in the 2022 cluster study. That's only as of the 2021 cluster study and things before it. Probably of that 5,000, probably 3,000, 3,500 need Cross Cascade North or South. And the amount of TSRs that are being submitted is steadily increasing, as you can see from the data here from the previous cluster studies. Basically, with the Oregon and Washington legislation, you've got a gold rush going on, where the amount of renewable projects submitted and the need transmission are increasing steadily, or basically almost doubling every year. So Bonneville is currently in the process of analyzing the 11 gigawatts, or it's 11,000 megawatts of TSRs that were submitted as of mid-August of last year, and we'll have those results in June, hopefully. Another item that could play a role in this is Puget Sound Energy's RFP for resources has at least raised the possibility of Puget acquiring dual fuel. These would be presumptively biodiesel and natural gas fueled CTs that would be located on the west side. And these could lessen the amount of east to west transmission capability that you needed, because you'd have the fuel like other CTs on the west side and in Puget service territory or near enough to it, and would lessen the amount of ATC available transmission capability that you need to get that capacity resource from somewhere on the east side to the west side. So that's an advantage. It also would provide what's called VAR support, basically would help with the stability on the west side as the last Centralia unit retires in 2025. That's a fairly technical issue, but it's a very important one. And then finally, the near-term upgrades that were in item 4 on the previous slide, the Raver-Schultz SCPs and the Portland 230 upgrade will help meet your renewable acquisition needs in the next 4 years. They're not as likely to be, that capacity is likely to be pretty much used up relative to the amount of clean energy needs that you have between 2026 and 2030. Key here is that we should know a lot more about these issues in June of this year. Bonneville's 2022 cluster study will come out, and we probably will have the short lists from both the Puget and the Portland General resource RFPs. So we'll have a lot more data on, okay, what's the transmission situation look like from Bonneville perspective, and then what resources are Puget and PGE planning to acquire in the next 4-year period. And that should tell us a lot more about what our out-year transmission circumstances are. Next slide, please. So in addition to having sufficient transmission to capacity to wheel the renewable energy across the Cascades to get to Seattle or Portland, you got a couple of what I'll call coping strategies. Puget is definitely going to use these. I'm less certain about how Portland General is approaching it, but 1 and 2 are kind of the key to this amount. First, you can repurpose transmission currently used to wheel thermal power to use wind, solar, and in Montana's case, pump storage potentially to loads. A good example of this is the Colstrip 3 and 4 transmission. If Colstrip 3 and 4 shut down in 2025, as is widely projected, that'll free up about 400 megawatts of transmission that is used for wheel Colstrip power that you could use for Montana wind and or pump storage for Puget, and 300 megawatts for Portland General. The Portland General is probably already pretty much committed to their Clearwater Wind project that they've got, and Puget is already planning to use the 300 megawatts that they had from Colstrip 1 and 2 shutting down to wheel that. So you can repurpose the transmission. You can do this, but it's complicated. It's doable, but you got to go and reevaluate your N-1/-1 reliability contingencies, and where are you going to get that if one of these resources goes out, and you got to look at bar support again, the voltage stability issues. You have a lot of big spinning mass with the Colstrip units that provides the stability need for the grid. The wind resources don't give you that. Now you can install inverters, you can do other things that will compensate for that, and you probably will need to do that, but there's a fair amount of work that needs to be done before you can wheel that power in the way that it's currently wheeled from Colstrip. The second strategy is to co-locate wind and solar resources near existing thermal resources or other resources for that matter. And you can basically assign, it's called redirect in the Bonneville terminology, not in all cases, but in many cases, the transmission that was previously used for the thermal resources to be used for the wind resources. And you can add batteries to that equation. And again, you can substitute, in essence, renewable wind or solar power for wind power, or excuse me, for thermal power. This is more CT power here to wheel that energy across the Cascades. Again, it's not simple, but it's doable. And you have a fair amount, as item 4 indicates, strategies to, that can do this. So go to the next slide, please. So what are the implications of this, and kind of where are we? Well, first off, it's not clear whether either Puget or PGE have sufficient long-term firm, which is the quality of transmission that most utilities require and most commissions require to serve load. They have long-term firm transmission to meet your 2030 energy goals. Basically, Puget thinks it has enough with the strategies that I listed before. Portland General is pretty clear in saying they don't have enough. So you've got a lot of issues in terms of, do you have sufficient transmission to meet your 2030 goals? Maybe, and maybe not. And that's a significant problem. Second, Bonneville needs to proceed with all due speed with the Raver-Schultz SCPs and the Portland 230 upgrades. And as I said when discussing those in earlier slides, I think that's proceeding as indicated. The energization dates for those are 2025 for the Raver-Schultz Raver SCPs and 2026 for the Portland 230 upgrade and the 500 megawatts of additional cross-cascade transfer capacity that'll provide. Third, BPA needs to do a regional study. Bonneville can do these things. Northern Grid is the FERC chartered entity of which Bonneville is a part to do this. But especially for the Oregon and Washington, Bonneville alone can do most of this stuff. It has to coordinate with the other utilities, but it has the ability to do this. The problem is Bonneville's workload is overwhelming, given the doubling of TSRs that it has to analyze in the various cluster studies, and given staffing constraints and other priorities, they're not likely going to be able to, at least what they're telling me, to do this until late, for another couple of years. That's an awfully long time before we know what the next major transmission addition beyond those two incremental ones that I mentioned before needs to be. And the problem is, if it involves any kind of substantial transmission construction, either 230 or 500, you're into a 10 to 15 year period. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's a possibility. And the Raver-Paul issue that I mentioned before could well be the kind of thing that you have to do. The $750 million there is because if you had to meet all those TSRs, you'd have to build another you'd have to convert a portion of the Cooley Olympia 287 line to 500. And that's a 10 plus year process and $750 million. So we'll have to see, but the sooner Bonneville can get what's the next major transmission project study done, the better off we'll be. As finally, we will need, in my view, the PAC and Idaho Power, who are building the Boardman to Hemingway line and the Gateway West line, in PAC's case, need to complete those lines. When completed, that will enable a transfer of about 1,500 megawatts of Utah solar and Wyoming wind into the Northwest. Now, that'll get it to Boardman, but you still have to get it from Boardman to Covington for Puget, which is the main Bonneville substation serving Puget, or into PGE's service territory. And that is a non-trivial kind of task, but unless you have B2H and Gateway West, you don't even have that option. So you need to do, to do those two things, irrespective of the Bonneville issues. Next slide, please. You also, next slide. You also have some interim measures, and I won't spend a lot of time on these. Bonneville has a conditional firm product that it provides, that a couple of conditional firm products, and one of them is their reassessment product, where you can get conditional firm, what's called conditional firm transmission, almost as good as firm. You can get it, it's interruptible for 200 hours a year for any purpose. But the problem with the reassessment product is it's only available for 2 years, and then it's a jump ball as to whether you get it extended or not, or canceled. You could extend that product to probably 5 or 6 years, maybe vary the interval curtailment hours, and that would give you some flexibility. It also could look at, there are vendors that provide what I'll call power flow control devices. These are devices that are kind of like mini series caps, in that you can hang them on the lines, you can put them in a substation. They're much cheaper than the series caps or other things, and they can be installed within a year. Or you can put them in a trailer, a mobile trailer somewhere along the right of way, and do this. Again, those would enable you to reschedule power, to offload some of your more heavily loaded lines onto lesser loaded lines. These are not substitutes for major transmission, but they could give you some additional flexibility in the next 8 years. Next slide, please. So what do we conclude? Well, east-west transmission is a major challenge, both on Cross Cascade North and Cross Cascade South, and potentially, although I don't have it mentioned here, on Raver-Paul. And we just have to be able to identify, based on the submitted transmission service requests and other contingencies, what the art of the possible is here. But suffice it to say, there are significant issues associated with whether we have sufficient east to west transmission to meet the 2030 clean energy goals of both Oregon and Washington. Puget thinks it does. PGE is pretty sure it doesn't. That's in summary. But even whether Puget thinks it does, it's still nervous, I guess I'd have to say, about the level of transmission that's available and whether that's sufficient or not. The problem here is, Megan alluded to this, with whether it's an RTO or even a day-ahead market. If you don't have sufficient transmission to meet your clean energy goals, you significantly suboptimize the regional diversity benefits you get from a day-ahead market or an RTO. You can do it. You'll get some benefits. You maybe get a half of them or a third of them, but you need the transmission to fully maximize the amount of benefits you get from forming these regional organizations. You know, you get economic benefits that help lower rates or keep rate increases down, and you get reliability benefits in terms of the resource adequacy program that the power pool is now undertaking. And finally, one other factor here that I didn't mention, but it's hanging out there, is none of these conclusions about adequate transmission really take into account much additional electricity growth due to electric vehicles or to gas displacement. And most of the studies you see the EV curve not really starting to pick up until 2030 or so. So maybe we're okay. But if you have a big rush to acquire EVs and a lot of electricity load growth as a result of that, none of the studies, the utilities account for some modest amount. But if that really comes in and picks up significantly post 2025, that gives us a whole new chunk of additional renewables we have to acquire that basically aren't even accounted for in the models now. So end of discussion. That ends my presentation.
Great. Randy, thank you. We got several questions in the chat. I want to ask you to address. The first one is, Randy, is there east to west capacity across Canada that might be utilized with improved north to south transmission lines instead of focusing on east-west across the Cascades?
No.
Nope.
That's the simple answer. Yes, there's some, but it's already fully loaded and it's involved with transmission between Alberta and BC Hydro, which is fairly limited. But right now, the limit is less in Canada, especially in 2025, when the brand new hydro project called Site C will come in. You'll have an additional 1,000 megawatts of hydropower. The problem is at the border, you've got an 1,800 megawatt transfer limitation. And then once you get over the border near Blaine, you have other transfer limitations just to get through the Puget Sound area to get to Western Washington or down to Portland. So there are transmission north-south transmission limits in BC that are the big constraint there.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of questions in chat, and then Katie, I'll come to you with a verbal question. Next question, Randy, is are the PSE, PGE energy and capacity needs based on today's loads, or do they take into account load growth by 2030, both from increased population and industry demands?
They take into account load growth as part of their IRP planning process. And the only thing that I'd say is what I repeated at the end of the presentation is that, if you have an unexpected, adoption or purchase of electric vehicles, you've got a risk out there that's more in the high scenarios that those utilities have studied than in the midpoint scenarios, and that could be an issue. But yeah, they take into account load growth as best those utilities can estimate it.
Great, Randy, thank you. Next question, and Randy, if you can't answer this question, I'm going to invite other folks on the call who have insight on this to answer the question. Would Washington State's position to transition away from natural gas affect the possibility of creating generation in Western Washington to offset the transmission from Eastern Washington?
Well, it's a good question. And my guess is Puget's going to test that. And the question is, are they serious about building this as a real dual fueled CT between now and after 2030? They have to use basically, renewable fuel of some sort, whether it's RNG or biodiesel. But are they intending to install this and run it? They'll still have to meet their 80% clean energy requirements, even if they run the West Side CT on natural gas. But are they going to do that, or is this more of a trial balloon to kind of see? But politically, that's going to be a significant issue, I'm sure. But it has real benefits in terms of both reliability, and freeing up more east to west transmission for renewables to get into their system.
Great. Thank you, Randy. Okay, so Katie, I'm going to come to you now, and then I've got one other question in the chat, two other questions in the chat here. So Katie?
Thanks, Rob. I just wanted to emphasize something Randy said that often gets lost in these discussions around power flow controls and grid enhancing technologies more generally and their potential. So I'm going to put a link in the chat that takes you to a Brattle study from last year called Unlocking the Queue that looked at a case study in Kansas and Oklahoma, two very wind-rich states in the Southwest Power Pool, and looked at, business as usual versus deploying these GETs, grid enhancing technologies, in the next 5 years, considering everything that's in the queue, which is 9.4 gigawatts. And they found that with the use of GETs, they were able to double the amount of renewable energy integrated onto the grid. And I wanted to highlight there are really no strong policy incentives here in Washington for deploying these sort of things. Maybe the solicitation process is mysterious. I think these conversations need to be had. And I also want to call attention to a federal funding opportunity where U.S. Department of Energy has, I think, $3 billion on the table rolling out later this year to be utilities will be eligible, state and local governments will be eligible, IPPs, to apply and get this funding and cut in half the costs of building these projects. So wanted to call that out. Thanks.
Great. Katie, thank you. And we'll look for that link in the chat. Okay, so this is what's going to happen. I've got one more question for you, Randy. And then I want to see if Bonneville Power or PSE or anyone who we've been talking about here on the phone has anything that they want to add. Let's see here. Next question is, Randy, are there any thoughts on the merits of a couple of high voltage direct current concepts, for instance, down the Columbia River to Metro Portland and from BC Vancouver Island down Olympic Peninsula to Olympia?
Yes, there are some. There is specifically one that's being studied right now. That's going to be proposed by it's called the Columbia, the Cascade Renewable Transmission Project, that would actually, I think start at John Day and go to Hillsborough, go under the Columbia River. All kinds of issues obviously there, but these guys are pretty sophisticated, and it's not cheap. I mean, it's in the $1 billion range, but it would provide you with 1,100 megawatts of additional transfer capability along that Cross Cascade South pathway. So that's one that's under active. It hasn't been formally proposed yet, but it will be, and it's worth taking a look at, even though it's got significant issues there. It's one way to do this. There are other more, I'd say, theoretical possibilities. One that's been discussed, is you could look to build into you could look to extend the line from Colstrip east with a direct current line that gets you into either SPP or the MISO service territory that would connect those two, us with the Northwest with either MISO or SPP, would provide you with a lot of additional flexibility. Huge, significant costs, significant issues, but that's an example of, and others have posed DC lines, within the Northwest. There are all kinds of issues associated with that, but there's those kinds of alternatives are starting to get very active discussions. And like I said, the Cascade Renewable Transmission Project is a real project it's in Northern Grid right now, as I understand it.
Great, thank you. So I've got two final hands here, and so I'm going to have Anders. I'm going to come to you, and then Megan, you're going to have the last word on this, and then we're going to then Kathleen, I'll see if you have anything else, and then we'll take a break. Anders. Anders, we can't hear you right now.
You're muted, Anders.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, great. I guess I'd just add that I think it's really important that when talking about which new transmission lines are needed and which ones should be prioritized, that we really match up the expected supply with the expected demand. And Randy mentioned the concept of the gold rush, and we do see the the really high volume of transmission service requests, and later this spring we'll have some updated information to release on which upgrades would be needed to respond to those requests. But I think it's really important that that you match up what the load serving entities need with what the developers are providing in order to determine when how much we can fit with these smaller upgrades like the series capacitors, and then when it's time to trigger one of the 9 or 10 figure major upgrades.
Great, Anders, thank you. Megan?
My big opportunity to bring it all home, but I was going to follow up on and ask a question to Randy about sort of institution. You said the concept that Glenn brought up about north to south DC and the real project that is currently in Northern Grid, those are worth taking a look at. When you say they're worth taking a look at, sort of, I think my struggle is, where do you think they're worth taking a look at institutionally? How do you think we would answer a question about whether those are useful, that type of thing is useful or needed over a 20-year horizon rather than the 10-year horizon that the Northern Grid looks at? And, I guess to connect to what Anders said, I absolutely agree that there needs to be this matching. And frankly, it's disappointing that we have so many TSRs that we don't have time for that, kind of broader planning that would give us a longer time frame and a more general look at something like these needs over 20 years. I don't know, Randy, do you have just a simple answer to that question of where one should?
Yeah, I do. Bonneville, simple answer. Northern Grid is, right now, to be blunt about it, Northern Grid is not functional. We've had it for 3-4 years. We have yet to get any decent studies out of it that I'm aware of that address this problem, which everybody admits, is a key problem. And so I would ask, I would say that the commissions need to engage Bonneville and the question should be, when, Bonneville, can you get the study done? I agree with Anders. You don't want to build more than you have, but right now, all we have are cluster studies, which, you're right, are not a good metric of the measure of what the demand is. They're great about supply because every developer, that's their chance to submit. But, probably only 5 or 10%, 10, maybe 10, 20% of the projects that's submitted, TSR submitted for transmission are for projects that will ever get built in a cluster study. So but you need to sort through that, and Bonneville is the best equipped to do the study. Now, the problem is they're so overloaded. I'll defer to Anders, although this is probably above his pay grade to answer the question, but their staff is so overloaded analyzing all of these TSRs in the cluster study, which is a FERC requirement, that they don't have time to get to the really important question that you ask is, do we need anything beyond the series caps and the Portland 230 upgrade to get to 2030 for the 80% goals? And if so, what is that? And what Bonneville's telling me, at least, is it's going to be late 2024 before we're going to have enough time to analyze that. Well, when I talked to Larry Beckett, all the PG, he says, I need it in 6 months. Well, there's kind of a critical mismatch from my perspective between what PGE and others, and Puget for that matter too, are saying they need and what Bonneville says when it can deliver. That's a problem. But Bonneville is the right organization, and maybe I'm biased on that. But unless Northern Grid can get its act together, we need Bonneville to do that, and then other utilities have to be coordinated with as appropriate, whether that's PGE or Puget or PAC or whoever, as part of that process, and that'll happen. But right now, it's not happening sufficiently quickly.
Thanks for letting me provoke Randy, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Megan. Kathleen, any final thoughts before we jump to break?
Yeah, this is Ravi from Bonneville. I'm sorry, I'm not in front of my computer. I can't raise my hand. Yeah, so thank you, Randy, and thank you, Commissioner Chair Decker, for your question. 2 things I want to clarify. Northern Grid is a very new organization. It's only gone through its first cycle. and it just entered its second cycle. So, gauging its performance and progress in a 2-year period would be, unfair to its members and what they have put in to get to the point of forming a regional planning organization that recently had NV Energy join. So it is definitely expanding its footprint. It's definitely looking into, further enhancing its regional studies. There are certain requirements that it can and cannot do as part of its filings with the FERC on Order 890 and Order 1000. But Randy, I can assure you and Chair Decker that we are working with the Northern Grid members through Power Pool to see whether we can do a decarbonization study. It is very, very early. I don't have much information, but there is discussion that is going on. Yes, we don't bring it forward until we have some good alignment. Second thing, Bonneville. Yes, Bonneville is completely overloaded and with the work that it is doing, addressing these TSRs. But in parallel, we are looking at some of the decarbonization, low carbon studies internally. It takes time. If you want to do the study correctly, it takes time to get the right electrification or the load projections, have the right amount of resources, scenario studies developed and performed, and address what the region transmission would look like. Meaning it's not, when CAISO did its 20-year transmission plan, under its SB 100 bill, the commission provided to the state of California's electrification load and what amount of resource was required to meet the capacity adequacy. All CAISO had to do was take that information that was formed and given to them and run the transmission study and come up with an informational amount of $30 billion of transmission upgrades. We don't have that in the Northwest. I think I have said this in several of my presentations. We do not have an integrated approach. And absent an integrated approach, you are going to see piecemeal studies. And piecemeal studies will result in large transmission projects, and it'll result in some small. The smaller ones are easily doable. Large ones, as Randy, you pointed out, it's going to take 15, 20 years, 10 to 20 years. It is the reality. So, we just haven't, completed those studies to really talk about it, but we are looking at it. Bonneville continues to look into those sort of, the challenges that the region is facing. We are working with PGE on looking at the Hillsborough area. We're looking at seeing how, Larry's concerns can be addressed over a BPA system as well as in PGE system. And we're doing the same thing with our counterparts in Puget Sound area with the Puget Sound area utilities. So at a minimum, I would just like people to know, we're doing what we can, the best we can with the information we have today. So a very good point, Randy, you're raising. It is a challenge, but I also don't want people to leave with the fact that Bonneville is sitting very quietly and ignoring. It is doing everything possible to come up with some scalable, flexible projects that can be done by 2030 to help meet the regional goals, whereas also identified what will be the large projects. Of course, at the end of the day, someone's got to pay. Our load serving entities and the supply side, demand and supply, they have to commit and they have to pay for it. Otherwise, you're looking at a lot of risky stranded investment costs that could impact the rates of the customer, Bonneville customers significantly. So that's just a brief comments I want to provide. Thank you.
Great, Ravi, thank you. So Will, I'm loath to break up such a good conversation, so I'm going to let it go a little bit longer and borrow time elsewhere. So Will, comment, and then if folks don't have any comments, Kathleen, I'll come to you.
I just want to comment on the planning. The planning does affect labor hugely as our contractors, because the contractors are who's going to build this. They don't get, transmission doesn't get built largely inside with the utilities. So trying to plan and get the apprentices and get the labor ready for this, we need to know as soon as possible as well. These projections are very important and commitments so we can plan.
Great, thank you, Will. Kathleen?
Thank you. This is just very rich discussion and very much thank you to Chair Decker, to Vic, to Randy, to Ravi and BPA. I want to thank you for your, and Anders, of course, for all your participation throughout this process. And the question I would like to leave with you and with everybody is, how can we help in our recommendations moving forward to get the resources? Are there resources at the federal level that we need to recommend and put in our report so that BPA has the resources that you need to do the planning in absence, frankly, of an integrated approach? And that's very much what we're facing here. So I really want to say thank you for your everybody's participation. But then the next question is, what do we do to help support getting to that future ideal state, which we all agree is critical, that we do it in an integrated way, and which costs less to everybody? and how can we do that? And how can this group make recommendations to help support that? Thanks.
Great. So as a brilliant segue there, when we come back from break in about 10 minutes, so at about 10:45, we're going to jump into the principles that we discussed a couple of meetings ago that get at regional planning, that get at the transmission questions. And so I'd like folks over the course of the 10-minute break to think about that question in light of what we learned today and the deep dives that we did in the conversation that we're having. Do the principles that we're going to put forth in the document reflect the strength and the importance of, and where we want to put what that emphasis looks like? So 10 minutes. Thank you all to the presenters. Please leave yourself logged into Zoom, because we're going to be setting up the breakout room. So if you guys just want to turn your video off and press mute, but please be back in 10 minutes at 10:45. Everybody, this is a 2-minute warning. We're going to get back together in 2 minutes. Okay, we're going to get back in 1 minute. Everybody, please start finding your way back to your Zoom and computers here. We're going to be getting started in 1 minute. Okay, if folks could flip on their video, give me a thumbs up or somehow signal to me that we've got life, that would be great. Okay, hi Diane, welcome back. Julie, welcome. Will, welcome. Others, welcome. Anders, thank you. Okay, so we've got only an hour and 15 minutes left today, and then we've got 3 hours set aside for tomorrow. Kathleen, anything that kind of popped into your head over the break that you want to start with here, or should we jump right into it?
Let's go.
Okay, great. So this is the opportunity for us to take what we talked about during the deep dive and to begin articulating to one another how we want to portray that in what the written report coming out of this group is. One of the things that I thought about over the break with Kathleen's closing comments is that there may be some imprecision in our conversation about how different organizations are doing different things, and we have the ability to control what that messaging looks like in a written format. But I don't want the fear of saying something like that conversation that we ended with from stifling the conversation. So it doesn't mean that anything is wrong, that BPA is doing. What we're trying to do is just identify a problem and then have an open discussion of what the right thing to do is. And so I really am deeply appreciative of everyone's willingness to enter into the conversation in that way. Okay, so what we're going to do with our remaining time, I want to spend 2 minutes here up front kind of giving you what I think the lay of the land is in terms of what we've got written down and what we've asked you to do. So coming out of meeting 2 and meeting 3, where we talked as part of our requirement from our charter and the charge to the legislature about what some of the need is for transmission. What are some of the key considerations to meet that need what is some of the key considerations to meet that need that we identified? We generated a set of principles that captured important challenges and findings. We also identified some principles for transmission planning and some principles for siting, permitting, and construction of upgraded and transmission and upgraded or new transmission infrastructure. Then on meeting 3 and in meeting 4, our last meeting, we started talking about the ways to expedite environmental review without compromising protections. And we've tried to capture what that conversation looked like in a second document. That first document that had findings and challenges, you've already had 2 bites at the apple of. What I want to do now is I want to go through what those changes look like. I'm going to ask Susan to do that, what those changes look like. And I think this is the place where we have the opportunity to take what we talked about and what we learned about in the previous section and make changes. So I want to prioritize doing that work. And then following that, then we're going to break out into 2 separate groups, and we're going to take a deeper dive into those principles around the opportunity to expedite environmental review. So what you're going to see up on the screen should look familiar to you. It is the document that we've asked you to, that we reviewed in real time, and then that we've asked you to provide comments on, and we've iterated this 3 times. So we're hopeful that this is really, really close. So what we're hoping to do is to get your feedback, especially in light of what we just heard, where the final tweaks are to this. So Susan, if you could bring that up on the screen and walk us through that. And then I'm going to be asking folks to answer the question that Kathleen ended with. Are there any other changes that we want to make based on what we heard to the sections on findings or challenges or planning? So Susan, take it away.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate that. I should be sharing the version. Okay, this is the version that was sent out to all of you. I hope you had a chance to give it a good look, and I don't need to restate the review opportunities that Rob captured, but we are hoping this is final draft, and we did really hear some provocative things here during our morning session. So what I'd like to do really is just to very quickly touch on the big changes that were made between the last time you saw this, and a number of you commented on the shared document version. So just want to recap those for people that maybe weren't as involved in that editing and making comments, and maybe haven't had as much chance to take a look at this document. So I'm going to touch on those real quick, and then we'll come back and, as Rob said, have a conversation about is this all we need to say, or is there something else? All right, so I'm going to try to follow along here. First, I'll say I really appreciated the comments and the clear amount of time that people spent giving us their very deliberative thoughts on this. We had a number of people do track changes as well as provide comments. So overall, you will see that, hopefully you will see that there was just improvement in the clarity and precision of the technical language. There's a lot of nuance in all of this, and so we appreciated that. So throughout the document, we did that. I'm just going to touch on the specific items here where we had some conversation, or we had a little bit more conversation around, just to bring those to your attention. So this number 2 under the background findings about decarbonizing our economy. This was really edited to reflect both that there's an anticipated increase in electricity demand and an increase in the need for new emissions-free resources, and that that this will necessitate some new pathways. So that was how that wording was massaged and tweaked a bit to try to capture those things. Another area that we spent a little bit of time on revising was this one about private utilities and where they stand here. So this was edited to better reflect their role in shifting to clean energy and the demand for new infrastructure that would be required for them to do so, and that the full solution will require contribution from all electric utilities. And I think I heard Randy reference something about that broader electric utilities concept as well. So that is on this one. 5, we also made a number of edits to here, and what we tried to do is clarified, first of all, that this we're referring to existing transmission corridors where constrained pathways exist for bidirectional flows. So just capturing that this is flow going both ways, not just one direction, east to west or west to east. Also clarified that the need for transmission capacity is pretty solidly projected in the east-west and north-south routes, and that there is a potential need for an I-5 route to capture potential off-wind energy development. So you will see that here in these 3 items that were listed. So clarified that. Okay, so now moving into challenges. Let's see, this one, number 2, we spent a little bit of time trying to clarify what peak demand means. Just being really clear about that and what the requirements are for meeting it. So there are some specific requirements, and the people who commented helped us to clarify that. For number 3 here, we expanded the descriptions of the kinds of comprehensive and single source planning information that is currently lacking and referencing the current role and limitations of existing regional organizations. I would say that some of the conversation that we just had before the break spoke to a fair amount of this. So again, we'll be interested to see if you have anything else you would want to say about some of the challenges there. Let's see, here, again, this really ties into what we just talked about. Existing regional transmission will face additional demands. So our noting here is we focus the challenge on future demands and what may be required to meet those demands. So did some editing there. And then I'm going to scoot down to the section B, emerging principles for transmission planning. We had a lot of comments in this section, a lot of interest and a lot of help in trying to work on this. So generally, we improved the description and distinctions between principles when it came to optimizing existing transmission, upgrading existing transmission, creating an integrated transmission system, and a regional diversified sourcing approach. And again, I think some of the things we talked about before break have some relevance to that. So specifically, under number 1, we added, we acknowledged the potential impacts from additional transmission infrastructure and the need to ensure that all options have been considered. So this is a new one that we added to reflect that. Let's see, we also here under optimize existing infrastructure, number 2, we expanded optimization of existing infrastructure through the use of alternative technologies. And also you'll see in here talked about trying to find ways to essentially not leave any capacity on the table. And again, there was, I think, some really interesting discussion about that before break. Number 4, while we didn't get a lot of comments on it, I would suggest to you that this one might be one to take a peek at when we have our discussion here in a minute, because I think there was some discussion before break that is probably relevant here. Number 6, we had a number of comments and spent some time working this one a bit. Where we landed here is really to, in a way, to simplify, cite new generation, where load, where it is feasible. And then we added a number of the factors that come into play in a feasibility in feasibility considerations. So that is where we modified number 6. And then number 9 here, and again, talked about this a bit. So number 9, we clarified the approaches for efficiently utilizing the system, speaking about both commensurate to the need and to the measures to alleviate backlog. And I think Anders was talking about that in his comments about wanting to make sure that you really understand what the need is as you're trying to think about how you alleviate backlog. So we worked on that. I think the final thing really in section C is we spent some time overall on just providing more specific language for improving expectations around the timing and the quality of tribal consultation. Also emphasized the principles of avoidance and minimization ahead of mitigation of impacts, and that was applicable to both important tribal cultural properties as well as environmental resources, and we all know that that crosses both of those spaces as well. So that's really the language that that we worked on in Section C. So that essentially touches on the big changes that we made in this version that you received that's called Final Draft. And so I think at that, I'm going to hand it back to Rob, and I will be working on this document. And as you discuss things, I'll try to capture if there are some key points that we need to respond to. So Rob, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. Susan, thank you. So Susan, if you could scroll back up to B3, I believe I wanted to start with.
B3,
no,
B3.
I'm sorry, A3.
A3.
Up top there.
This one?
No, I'm sorry. I missed. I missed the one where we talk about regional planning.
Here.
Yes, thank you. Number 3. Okay, so this is the one I want to start with. So I know that we talked a lot about regional planning in the previous section. So I'm going to just put it right out there on the table. And then after I do that, then I'm going to ask if there are any specific one of these principles that you all want to talk collectively about. So right now, what we say that tries to, in a short way, kind of capture the problem and description of the regional planning is right there on number 3. No single source exists for comprehensive planning information. And I wanted to see, as Susan said, are there changes that folks want to see be made to this principle or other principles in light of the regional planning conversation that we just had? Places you want to strengthen the language, places that you think we have the opportunity to clarify. And so this is the time where we get to take what we talked about before and then try to be clear about what the voices of this group. And Susan, can you take a look at Glenn's question? Isn't there another principle that's more directly on the roles of regional transmission planning?
Right. So this is actually a finding. So this isn't one of the principles. So I think we do have a principle that talks about that, and I think that's down in. Do you want me to skip down to that?
Yes, please. Yep.
Okay.
And
sorry,
that's what I was looking for.
Sorry if the scrolling makes anybody feel a little bit nauseous in here. So we this one for work across state boundaries to create an integrated transmission system. I think speaks to that, and I feel like and I'm scrolling around here. Here we go. Yeah, number 7, expand regional planning coordination.
Yeah. So what do folks think? Glenn, do you have an opinion on just to put you on the spot there, since you dropped something in the chat there? Do we think we have to say something that's stronger than what we have there? We have explore whether an RTO would create efficiencies, including market models for energy dispatch that are not reliant on the traditional contract-based method. So we think that this is the one that kind of captures a little bit of what we talked about before.
You know, I think it's a really good principle. I don't have any suggestions about any changes to what's already here, but if others have thoughts on that, I'm certainly open to ways that we might strengthen it or make it more specific if people think it should be.
Yeah, Will?
Well, I just want to throw it out there. Do we go so far as to suggest yet another layer, committee or whatever you want to title it, that would be responsible for that? Do we have that power to suggest that, or is that what people are thinking, that there needs to be one new group that could bring all that together?
Yeah. So right now we say explore whether. Is that strong enough for for folks. Sense anyone have any reaction to what Will said there?
I think there may be groups looking at this, so I don't know quite how to say it better, other than encourage. Well, I don't know, because we don't know what the impacts of that are, so I hesitate to go there. Actually, I was thinking even, there's an organization that does regional transmission planning, but what we really want is to also help direct funds for regional transmission planning efforts, even if that means, getting resources to BPA to do it. So there's the organization piece, but that's the, enabling however we can is another option.
When are we talking about two parts, both regional planning and then a regional siting entity, right? Because there's the development of what plan would need to happen, but then there's the actual siting and funding of siting piece of it.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Will, did you still have your hand up, or can I lower your hand? Oh, great. I've got Katie, then Nicholas, and then definitely want to ask folks to reflect on what Kathleen said about directing resources. Katie, then Nicholas.
Yeah, so my comment is in response to Kathleen's comment, and thinking about how to make this more actionable. Something that we have thought of is perhaps advising the governor's office to put together a RTO task force or something like that, so that there are people regularly thinking about next steps to take us in that direction, because we have a pretty good idea that there are efficiencies here. So how do we make this happen here in Washington?
Great, awesome. Thank you, Katie. Nicholas.
So I guess I'm perhaps a little confused, but I've always considered RTOs as more of a operational entity. It basically makes sure that the plant or the facilities that you have are used as efficiently as possible. I see that slightly different than the planning, and I think several people in the comments made similar are making similar sorts of points, which is it seems like we're mixing two roles here, and want to make sure that if we're doing that, we're doing it intentionally and not inadvertently.
Does someone want to reflect on that? Someone who has got deeper familiarity with the RTO than what an RTO does than I do. Yeah, Glenn, please.
I raised my hand before you put that credential requirement at the end of your question, but I do share that impression with Nicholas, and we've heard ideas about inter-regional planning, and also the idea of proactive transmission planning, trying to get ahead of the piecemeal approach that the current process through Northern Grid tends to focus on. And I think there's both are good. I mean, both the exploration and development of an RTO is a good thing to do in terms of operational, efficient use of the transmission system and the generating system, but then also a stronger, more region, west-wide focused transmission planning function would also be a good thing to do.
Yeah, and so thank you, Glenn. I think Stu had the same suggestion and put it into the chat that perhaps we're trying to have number 7 here do too much heavy lifting, and that we're really thinking about two different potential principles there.
And just to clarify that, I mean, when I talk in there about west-wide, I mean the Western United States. Sometimes we've talked a lot about Western Washington being the place where a lot of the electricity needs to get to. But what I mean is here in this context is planning across the Western United States for a robust transmission system.
Great. Thank you, Glenn.
I also saw Julie's question in the chat. Can you read it, Rob?
Yeah. So Julie's question in the chat, for the folks that are on the live stream, it says, Julie provided from the Northern Grid website. She said, so it seems like a regional planning organization exists. And from the Northern Grid website, it says, Northern Grid is the outcome of a single transmission planning region, facilitating regional transmission planning, enabling one common set of data and assumptions, identifying regional transmission projects with a single stakeholder forum, and eliminating duplicative administrative processes.
So I am one of the 2 state representatives to Northern Grid. So I wanted to explain that there are elements of regional planning. Their planning horizon is 10 years. So I think that fundamentally, and that's what's required from the federal orders that people talked about earlier, the FERC 1000. So part of it is, yes, that exists, and it looks at it from the perspective of those organizations like PSE and BPA in how they're going to look at the next 10 years. But we don't really have something which says, here are the policy goals of the states, and puts that together with what are the variety of ways that we can reach that. So it's a little more of a just-in-time planning organization than a long-term vision of the outcome. And maybe it can grow in that ways too. So I just wanted to share that. So yes, there are some really good elements there. I think what we're concerned about here is the longer-term vision and how we reach it.
Ravi?
Oh, can you guys hear me?
Yes, of course. Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So, so Northern Grid's planning process, which is true, it's a 10-year horizon, and it does account for policies, and the policies are, if you look at the Northern Grid charter and what was submitted to FERC, at least the enrolled parties are required to, provide policy-related impacts to whether it's to the load or resource planning into the data submittal. And policies are considered as part of the regional planning process. It doesn't get into the 20-year planning because the current planning horizon, as reflected in the FERC Order 1000 and Order 890, is 10-year planning. Now, I know the ANOPR that came out, it is projecting for a 20-year planning. And if and when that happens, then all the regional planning organizations will have to refile their organizational attachment case and other things to align with the new FERC orders. So yes, it is true that it only looks at 10 years, but it does look at the policy to a certain degree. It does. Utilities are supposed to provide data and assumptions that conform to the policies that are applicable to each of those member utilities based on their state. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. The second thing I did want to reflect, Rob, was a question that came up about what is RTO? What does RTO really do? And I know there are two ways the RTO could be looked at. And I know I believe, and I may be miscoding here, but I believe SPP started as a regional transmission operator where it only did just basically have a single system operation. It did not get into markets. And it slowly evolved into encompassing markets into its full RTO feature. But an RTO is defined by FERC, and RTO and ISOs are pretty much the same. ISOs are more confined to a single state. RTOs are multi-state based. But basically, in a full-blown RTO, you have not just operations of the transmission system, you also have the regional planning, the planning for its footprint that it does. It also includes defining what transmission is required based on reliability needs or driven by public policy objectives, or what is derived because of commercial or congestion-based transmission, and it goes through the cost allocation process. So it has all of those quirks to it besides just the operations and the markets and the organized market piece. So think of it as a three-legged stool. One-legged stool is your operations. Second is your markets, which includes resource adequacy and congestion pricing and clearing and all of that. And third leg is the regional planning, which includes planning for the footprint, defining the transmission needs driven by multiple drivers, and then doing cost allocation, and then getting the approval by the board. Again, RTO or an ISO or an RPO. I don't think any one of those are mandated, I believe, into construction. Construction is done by the utilities who have been whose footprint those transmission gaps have been identified on, whether it's from a reliability standpoint or commercial or driven by public policy objective. Hope that helps.
Awesome. Thank you, Robbie, very much. Okay, so in light of those clarifications, this is what I'm hearing, and I want to see if folks are seeing it and hearing it the same way, that we really are saying two different things here, that I think there are two different principles that we want to, that are going to work in conjunction with each other. And then there's a question of what does this group want to say with regard to funding and resources. So I want to see if other folks have thoughts about whether or not there's something in here regarding funding and resources, and then I'm going to propose a path forward for how we kind of work through this kind of quickly. So any other thoughts there on direct funding or resources, or any reaction to something more specific like Katie suggested?
It looks to me like the 7A is really about exploring this RTO long term, and 7B is about doing this decarbonization planning with a 20-year horizon immediately, not waiting till there's an RTO to do it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Stu. Any thoughts about the resources piece?
This is Joe. I know that there is federal funding that I think can assist utilities in doing some of this work. I know that there is something that came out of the latest infrastructure bill is that for instance, the federal government is willing to serve as sort of an anchor tenant on newly constructed lines, perhaps until the line can be fully subscribed to other tenants, so to speak. So I guess certainly there is federal level funding or assistance, to my knowledge, that may help in this.
Okay, so in the interest of time, what I'd like to ask is maybe by show of hands in Zoom. So raise your hand or give me a wave if your hand wave. I'm looking for maybe 3 or 4 volunteers of this group that like immediately following this meeting, like over the course of the next week, we can work with on honing language for this kind of coupled set of principles to get back out for the group to look at, because time is now our enemy, as we've got 1 meeting left. So I'm gonna try to push for more specificity. So by show of hands, if I could get maybe 3 to 4 volunteers, and we can do this all probably via email. So I got Glenn. Thank you, Glenn. Anybody else I need 3 more volunteers plus FSEC. So I'm automatically volunteering FSEC. So I'm looking for 2 or 3 other folks. Thank you, Lynn Nicholas. 1 more person, come on. Be a hero in front of your colleagues. And all my ask is to be, thank you, Clint, perfect. So I got Clint, Nicholas, Glenn, and FSEC. So what will be an action here is maybe Ross can take the next run at drafting what this language looks like, and then over the course of the next week via email, we can try to land on some language that we're then going to distribute via email to the full group to look at. Awesome. Okay, so based on the conversation we had this morning, are there other places that folks want to come and visit with regard to kind of planning or messaging that folks want to make sure show up in here? And you know, we didn't have the ability to do a crosswalk between what we heard with what's in here in the 10-minute break, but I do want to see folks have other things that they want to kind of put on the table here for the principals here. Yeah, Allison.
So one of the things that both state preservation offices and the tribes are facing is lack of staffing. And under the federal rules, both tribes have to review all these transmission projects as well as the state preservation office. Congress hasn't properly funded anybody. They only gave tribes in FY22 less than $2,000, which doesn't even cover inflation. SHPOs, well, we got $40,000. So the problem is when you talk about environmental streamlining, and I don't know if this is the right place, but you sort of generally asked, is that you need human beings. And for the preservation cultural resource side, we're not being funded at the state or federal level for enough literal human beings to do the work without even trying to streamline it. So I think there is a need, I don't know how you want to put that in there, a need to remind Congress that in order to upgrade all these, to provide for green energy sources, they are going to have to properly fund tribal preservation offices and state preservation offices to do the review work, to not only make sure it's done properly, but to even expedite it. Because you can't even expedite it now because you don't have enough people to do it, to do the basic reviews.
Great, thank you, Allison. Okay, other thoughts either from this morning, and now I just want to make it more broad. So other places within this, within these principles that I know many people were in there that that provided comments. Any other thoughts that you have, comments that you think we did not adequately address? Any other red flags that that you had in your review of this? Yeah, Sarah, please.
Yeah, and I'm trying to pull the language up, but the new language around alternatives consideration is very broad to say that all have or will be exhausted in this, rapid technology development climate. That can be an endless and never-ending inquiry, especially over the time that these projects take. And so I think that I would favor having something more narrow than exhausting all alternatives, right? That's just too broad to be practicable. And it doesn't really even respond to prudency requirements and things like that, which naturally tend to narrow some alternatives, or the need to have technologies fully developed and reliable at a utility scale. So I think that heading just has to be tailored in, right? Is what I'd ask anyway.
Yeah, and Sarah, if you've got specific thoughts on how to do that, that isn't such a big blanket statement. We've noted what the concern is, and if you have specific ideas on how to improve language, please send them to us via email. But we will try to capture that change. Thank you, Sarah.
Happy to send language.
And don't let that be a deterrent for people offering comment that I'm going to be asking you to participate. It's an empowering comment there. It's empowering to be a part of the process here.
So Rob, could I just ask a quick question with regard to language?
Yeah, Katie.
So when these changes are made, perhaps, offline conversations and whatnot, will we get another look at this? It's called final draft right now. So I'm just curious, because I do think this first emerging principle has a lot of potential, and I just want to make sure that that's not lost when wording is changed.
Yeah, 100%. you will know when it's your last call, and this is your second. It's about second to last call. We're hoping that what we're doing here is surgical, tactical changes here, not broad changes. But you will, yes, definitely, Katie, between now and our next meeting, get another chance here.
Great, thank you.
But again, we're looking for the surgical changes at this point. Okay, any other thoughts on this document before we go to the next document?
Hey, Rob, just a quick question.
Yes.
Allison had made that suggestion about properly funding, and I was hearing that she was talking about on the planning side, but it may be that it was more around the siting, permitting, and constructing. But in any case, we don't actually have specific language that talks about funding in order for that to occur. So does the group want us to go ahead and add that in? And if so, would we add that under C1? Does it fit under planning? Don't know, Allison, if you have other thoughts on that, or Rob.
You know, if you want, it depends where you want the tribes to participate. If you want them to participate up front, they don't have the staff. When you want them to do the project reviews, they don't have the staff. And neither does the state, and neither does our agency. And I know the Oregon SHPO doesn't have it either. The Idaho SHPO is just, I mean, they are base people, maybe 8 people. So, you know, we're just not funded from the front end to the back end to do all this work. And as Kathleen knows, even when we worked with the legislature to give at least our agency funding, that didn't even work very well. So I don't know how to get the message to people that unless you give agencies the ability to hire other human beings, both, and I'm saying Idaho, Oregon, Washington, state offices plus tribal offices, you know, we're going to end up being blamed for hanging things up.
Glenn?
Yeah, there's more than one siting related activity that I've been working on over the last year or so. And so I may be confusing conversations, but I sure had the impression that that we were looking at recommending better funding for the environmental and cultural review work, allowing that to happen earlier in the process, and getting away from what we heard at the last meeting, about just being overwhelmed with the number of review requests that the tribes and the Historic Preservation Office and Fish and Wildlife and others get. So yeah, I think that would be a good recommendation for us to make if we haven't already.
And if I can jump in to say, I'm thinking, Glenn, it may actually be in that in the meeting 4 principles where we talked about the environmental review. It may be there, and I'm not seeing it because I'm not in the right document. So if we did have some language there, we could bring it over here if people were amenable to that.
Yeah, so Susan, I thought the same thing. I just looked at the language, hadn't committed it to memory. We don't actually come out and say explicitly, we identify all the different needs to do what we had talked about, but we don't come out explicitly. We say things like we're going to leverage the expertise of DAHP. We are going to lean into tribal consultation and relationships with tribal participants. We don't say and therefore we need more resources directed at it. So what I'm hearing is that that needs to be augmented here. Yeah, Diane?
Just going to say, I think we should be identifying areas where funding's needed. And in addition to the ones that we're talking about here, I think we should also acknowledge that there's a need for local government and also for state agencies. If we're looking for dedicated staff to work on this, then that might be something that we need to look at funding for as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you, Diane. Okay, other thoughts here? Okay, so this is what's going to happen. We've got 25 minutes today left to set up our conversation tomorrow. And so the way that we're going to do this is we're going to break ourselves up into two groups. Susan's going to have one, I'm going to have one, and we're doing that just to increase the bandwidth of you all's opportunity to participate. What we're going to do is we're going to break up into two groups, and we're going to look at how we documented the results of the conversation that we had at our last meeting around principles around expedited review. And what we hope to do is we hope to, as we discuss those, identify the places where you want to have a conversation with the whole group. Because we're now towards the end of the meeting, we're not going to make any decisions about language that doesn't involve the entire group. So what we want to do in the next 25 minutes is walk through the principles that came out of the last meeting and ask you, as you look at them, what questions do you have, or what do you have to offer some clarity, or what questions you want to talk to the whole group about, so that we're able to tee that up for the whole group tomorrow. For the folks that are on the live stream, Zoom does not have the ability to live stream from breakout rooms. So what we're going to do is when we move into the breakout rooms, it's going to feel as if there is no meeting happening. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be recording the breakout rooms so that then we can post the Zoom recording, so folks have the ability to hear what occurred during those breakout rooms. We were going to come back at 11:55 just to reconnect and prepare ourselves for the day tomorrow, and then we will adjourn right at noon. Susan, anything I'm forgetting about breakout rooms? And Kathleen, I'll see if you have anything else before we go into the breakouts.
Nope. I think you got it, Rob.
Okay, Kathleen, anything? Okay. So Tess, if you could please put us in the breakout rooms, and Susan, don't forget we have to record locally.
Gotcha.
Okay. All right, so this can be a little bit jarring.
Justin, looks like I missed you here. Hold on just one sec. Let me move you over.
No problem.
Hey, Kim. I don't know if you can hear me yet here, but we are in breakouts, and so I can just pop you into room 2.
Tess, this is Rob. If you could go back up to slide number 3 for me, that would be great. Okay, well, welcome back, everybody. I know that breakout rooms can be a little jarring. You're tossed over here, you're tossed over here. We're back together again as a full group. What I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to spend the next 2 minutes talking to you about what we plan to do tomorrow so you can prepare for that. And then Kathleen, I'll come to you for any final thoughts. So for tomorrow, the first 40 minutes of our conversation is going to be on overburdened communities. And the earlier today, we had those deep dives on topics that other folks suggested. Well, this is another topic that folks suggested, but we felt as if we wanted to group those other 3 conversations so we could talk about the meeting 3 principles. Mariel from Front and Center is going to share some thoughts with folks about what are some of the things that could show up in a report from this group about transmission corridors and overburdened communities, with the hopes that that conversation that we have tomorrow could potentially lead to either enhancements of the existing principles that we have, or new principles. What we're then going to do is we're going to come back as a group, and we're going to go over the document you all just reviewed in those breakout groups. The purpose of those breakout groups was to give us, the facilitators, a signal of where there's energy so that we're able to focus that conversation as best that we can. We then have 30 minutes of conversation at the end that we want to use as a round robin. The purpose of that round robin is to get a temperature check from the folks on the group. We're through 5 of 6 meetings, and we are on a path of producing a report between now and meeting 6, and we just want to see where folks are at. So we've got 30 minutes set aside for the round robin. And then, as always, and thank you, Katie, for flagging that in the chat, we have time for public comment set aside at the end for the folks on the live stream. Tomorrow is your opportunity for public comment at 11:45 or 11:50. And then we will adjourn right at noon. I'm going to thank you all for your participation today, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Kathleen, to share any final thoughts before we adjourn for the day. Kathleen?
Thank you. Been a very full morning, lots of presentations and engagement about critical issues. Thank you, everybody, for your attention. It's a lot to spend this amount of focus over this period of time in the morning, and really appreciate everybody's partnership throughout this process and look forward to our conversation tomorrow. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you later. Take it easy. Talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks all.